On her wedding day, she walked toward the altar with a heart full of love, but what awaited her wasn't the future she dreamed of. The early morning sun filtered through sheer curtains, casting soft streaks of gold across the room. Emma sat in front of the vanity, her eyes focused on her reflection as her best friend Rachel secured the last pin in her elegant updo. Her heart was a mixture of excitement, nerves, and disbelief. This was the day she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. She was getting married. "Breathe, Emma," Rachel said with a teasing grin, smoothing out the lace of Emma's wedding gown. "If you keep clenching your jaw like that, you'll be sore before you even say I do." Emma let out a breathy laugh, her chest rising and falling. I know. I don't know. I want everything to be perfect." Rachel leaned in close, her grin softening into a look of reassurance. "It is perfect. You're perfect. Ethan's going to lose it when he sees you walk down that aisle." Emma felt her heart flutter at the thought. Ethan had always been a calm and composed man, but she loved the way his eyes softened every time he looked at her. Her fingers traced the delicate fabric of her dress, feeling the intricate lace that had taken weeks to choose. She was ready. Today was going to be the start of something beautiful. But just as Rachel was about to speak again, Emma's phone buzzed on the table, the vibration sharp against the wooden surface. She glanced at it, expecting a message from Ethan or a last-minute question from a vendor. Instead, the screen displayed unknown caller. "Who calls on a wedding day?" Rachel snorted. "Ignore it. Probably a telemarketer." Emma hesitated but picked up the phone anyway. "Hello?" A few seconds of static echoed on the other end, followed by a low, distorted voice. The kind you'd hear in a crime show when someone was trying to mask their identity. "The truth always comes to light," the voice rasped slowly, each word deliberate and heavy. Emma's chest tightened. "Who is this?" she asked, gripping the phone harder than she realized. Her eyes darted toward Rachel, who raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Don't look for him," the voice continued, ignoring her question. "No one will find him." Her heart stopped. "What? Who are you talking about?" But there was no response. The line clicked and the call disconnected. Emma pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at the screen as though it might offer an explanation. "Emma?" Rachel's voice drew her back. "What's wrong? You look like you just saw a ghost." Emma hesitated, the words replaying in her mind like an eerie echo. "The truth always comes to light. Don't look for him." "Nothing," Emma lied, locking her phone and placing it face down on the table. "It was probably just a prank call." Rachel eyed her for a moment but didn't press further. "Weirdos," she muttered, returning to fluffing Emma's veil. "Forget it. Today is all about you." But Emma couldn't forget it. Her fingers twitched against the edge of the vanity as unease settled into her chest. She glanced once more at her phone. It stayed silent. The church bells echoed through the air, each chime like the countdown to a dream come true. Guests filled the pews, the quiet murmur of conversation weaving through the air. Light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the room with rich hues of red, blue, and gold. Emma stood just beyond the grand oak doors, her father, Thomas, at her side. He squeezed her arm with fatherly pride. "You ready, kiddo?" Her eyes stayed fixed on the large double doors, her breathing slow and steady. She had been so sure, so confident. But now her nerves felt different. The weight of that earlier phone call clung to her like a shadow, cold and unwelcome. "Emma?" Thomas leaned forward, concern creasing his brow. "You okay?" She blinked and nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just, big moment, you know?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Biggest one of your life, honey." The soft notes of the wedding march began and Rachel, now standing behind her, gave her a small push. "That's your cue, bride of the century. Go make your grand entrance." Her heart pounded like thunder in her chest. Just nerves, she told herself. Just nerves. The oak doors swung open. Every head turned. Emma stepped forward. The train of her dress flowed behind her like a river of silk. Her eyes scanned the crowd, smiling faces, teary eyes, the soft murmurs of admiration. But none of it mattered. Her gaze locked on the altar. On him. Ethan wasn't there. Her steps faltered, her breath catching in her throat. She blinked rapidly, thinking maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But no. The altar was empty. The priest stood in position, his hands folded before him, but Ethan was supposed to be right there. Her father stopped walking, his grip tightening on her arm. "Emma?" he whispered, glancing toward the altar. Confusion and concern flashed across his face. "Where is he?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her pulse pounded in her ears, muffling the soft whispers now spreading through the guests like wildfire. Rachel, now standing behind her, moved forward. "It's probably just a delay," she said quickly, her eyes darting around the room. "Maybe he's stuck in traffic?" "No," Emma said softly, her eyes locked on the spot where Ethan should have been. "No, he wouldn't be late. He's never late." Her father pulled out his phone, thumbing through contacts. "Let me call him. I'm sure he's just—" "Emma," a voice called from the side. She turned. "Marcus, Ethan's best friend." His face was pale, his eyes downcast. Something in his expression told Emma everything she needed to know. Her breathing stopped. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice shaking with barely contained fear. "Emma, Marcus glanced at the crowd, clearly aware that every guest was watching him now. He stepped forward, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "He wanted you to have this?" Her eyes narrowed in confusion, her hands still frozen at her sides. "No," she said, stepping back. "No, Marcus. Where is he?" "Emma," he said quietly, pleading with her to just take the letter. Her hands shook as she reached for it. Her heart thundered against her chest as if it already knew the contents inside. Slowly, she unfolded the paper, her eyes darting across Ethan's handwriting. "Emma, I'm sorry. I can't do this. Please don't look for me. You deserve better than me. I know this hurts, but it's for the best. Don't try to find me. Please. Goodbye." Her eyes lingered on that final word. Goodbye. The world tilted. Her breath came in shallow, rapid bursts and her knees buckled. Before she could hit the ground, her father caught her, his strong arms pulling her close. "Emma. Emma, breathe." Rachel knelt in front of her, gripping her hands. Her voice was frantic but firm. "Look at me. Look at me." The guests were on their feet now, their voices rising in a mixture of shock and confusion. "Did he leave her?" someone whispered. Emma gasped, her body convulsing as the weight of it all crashed down. She felt like she was falling into a void. Her wedding, her future, everything she had planned. Gone. "No," she muttered weakly, shaking her head. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. Her father hugged her tightly, rocking her like he had when she was a little girl with scraped knees. "It's okay, honey," he murmured, his own voice shaking with disbelief and anger. "It's okay. We're going to get through this." But it wasn't okay. It would never be okay. Ethan was gone. And deep down she had a feeling she knew why. The world was a haze of muffled sounds and blurred shapes. Emma's eyes fluttered open and she blinked slowly, her head throbbing like she'd been struck with a sledgehammer. The scent of perfume, sweat, and the faint tang of aftershave lingered in the air. Dim, golden light from the stained glass windows washed over the faces staring down at her. "Emma, can you hear me?" Her mother's voice broke through the fog, tight with panic. Emma groaned as she tried to sit up. Strong hands, her father's hands, lifted her with care. Her head lolled for a moment before she straightened it. Rachel knelt next to her, eyes wide with fear, her hands gripping Emma's arm. "Take it slow, sweetie," her father said softly, his voice thick with concern. "You fainted. You're okay now. Just breathe." Her lips felt dry and her mouth tasted like copper. She touched her face and felt her makeup smeared across her cheek. Slowly, reality settled in. The altar. The guest. The empty space where Ethan should have been. Her heart twisted painfully, memories crashing in like thunder. The letter. The words. "Don't look for me. Please." Her breathing grew shallow, each inhale quicker than the last. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. Her voice was hoarse. "No, no, no." "Emma, honey, calm down," her mother pleaded, running her hand down Emma's back in slow, soothing strokes. "We'll figure it out. You need to rest." "Don't tell me to rest, Mom." Emma snapped, her voice sharp and jagged. "He's gone. Ethan left me." The church fell silent. The whispers that had rippled through the guests stopped as every eye turned toward her. Emma's chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths. Her vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't from fainting. Tears welled up and spilled over, hot streaks of salt down her face. "Where is he?" Emma barked, looking around wildly. Her eyes locked onto Marcus, standing near the edge of the group, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You," she growled, pointing at him. "You knew, didn't you?" Marcus flinched, eyes flicking to the floor. "Emma, I didn't." "Don't lie to me," she shouted, her voice raw with betrayal. She tried to get to her feet, but her legs wobbled and her father caught her before she collapsed. "You brought me the letter. You knew he wasn't going to be here, and you waited until I was at the altar to tell me?" "I didn't know," Marcus muttered, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for an escape route. "I only found out this morning." "Then why didn't you call me?" Emma shot back. Her father's grip on her arms remained firm, grounding her, but it wasn't enough to cool the fire raging in her chest. Why wait until I'm in front of all these people? You knew. You knew. Emma, Rachel said softly, trying to place a hand on her shoulder. Emma shrugged it off. He's not the one you should be mad at. Don't defend him, Emma hissed, her eyes still locked on Marcus. Her mind felt like it was spiraling, like she was being pulled deeper into a whirlpool with every second. The eyes of the guests, their judgmental stares, burned into her. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Marcus ran his hands over his face, letting out a long, exhausted breath. I didn't know how to tell you, he said, his voice low, like he was confessing something shameful. I didn't want you to hate me too. Emma snorted a bitter, humorless laugh. Too late for that. Her mother gripped her hand tightly. Emma, stop this. This isn't the place. No, Emma said, her voice growing firmer. She yanked her hand free and stepped out of her father's grasp. Her legs felt stronger now, her resolve hardening. Her gaze swept across the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces, eyes filled with pity and curiosity. Enjoy the show? She asked, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Several people looked away, guilt flashing across their faces. Emma snatched the crumpled letter from her father's hand and held it up like evidence in a courtroom. Since you're all so interested, why don't we read it together? Emma, no, Rachel hissed. You don't have to. Emma, her father said softly, stepping forward, but she held out her hand to stop him. Don't, Emma said, her eyes darting to each guest who dared to meet her gaze. Don't act like you're protecting me now. I'm not hiding from this. She flattened the letter in her hands, her fingers trembling only slightly. Clearing her throat, she read aloud. Emma, I'm sorry. I can't do this. Please don't look for me. You deserve better than me. I know this hurts, but it's for the best. Don't try to find me. Please. Goodbye. Her voice didn't crack. She didn't cry. But the silence that followed was deafening. Emma folded the letter slowly, deliberately, and slipped it into the pocket of her wedding gown, a dress she had spent weeks dreaming about. The church doors swung open and a gust of cold air rushed in, carrying the fresh scent of rain. It felt like the world itself was reacting to her heartbreak. For a moment, she considered walking through those doors and running as far away as possible. But something inside her shifted. No, she muttered, shaking her head. Her eyes found Rachel's, then her father's, then Marcus's. No, I'm not running. Not today. Emma, you need to get out of here, Rachel whispered, glancing at the crowd. You don't have to do this right now. But Emma was already walking toward Marcus. The crowd parted like waves as she approached him, her eyes narrowing like she was about to issue a challenge. Marcus stood his ground, his face a mask of uncertainty and shame. You're taking me home, she said firmly. Now. Emma, you don't have to do this, Marcus repeated, holding up his hands like she was a wild animal ready to attack. Let me explain. I'll drive you somewhere else, somewhere quiet. Her eyes bore into him like daggers. Take me home, Marcus. He stared at her for a long moment, then let out a sharp breath. All right. Her father stepped forward. Emma, sweetheart, we can all go home together. Let's get you out of this dress first. No, she said, her eyes never leaving Marcus. I'm staying in it. He'll see me in this dress when I find him. Her father started to protest, but Emma's face was stone cold. The girl who had walked into this church expecting love and devotion was gone. The woman standing in front of them was something else entirely. Marcus nodded, his face grim, and walked toward the exit. Emma followed, head held high, each step deliberate. Rachel hurried after her, tugging at the train of her dress to keep it from dragging. Emma, please, Rachel whispered. Don't do anything crazy. Crazy would be letting him get away with this, Emma shot back, her voice cold as steel. They stepped outside and the cool air hit her like a slap to the face. The clouds above swirled, heavy with rain that hadn't yet fallen. Marcus's car sat parked at the curb, and he walked to the driver's side, unlocking it with a beep. Emma didn't wait for him to open the door for her. She yanked it open, slid inside, and slammed it shut. Rachel hesitated at the curb, glancing between the car and Emma's parents, who were now stepping outside. She bit her lip, then slipped into the back seat beside Emma. You're not doing this alone, Rachel said firmly. Not a chance. Emma didn't reply. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Her lips moved slightly as if repeating a silent promise. I'm going to find him, she whispered, her voice too soft for anyone but herself to hear. I'm going to find out why. The car ride to Ethan's apartment was as silent as a tomb. Rain had begun to fall, drumming steadily against the windows. Emma sat in the passenger seat, still in her wedding dress, her hands folded neatly on her lap. The ivory lace looked out of place against the cracked leather of Marcus's old sedan. Her fingers traced the fabric absent-mindedly, but her mind was razor-sharp, replaying every second of the last few hours. The letter. The phone call. Marcus's face when he handed her that note. Every detail swirled in her head like a storm she couldn't quiet. Rachel sat in the back seat, her gaze shifting from Emma to Marcus every few seconds like she was waiting for one of them to explode. "Emma," Rachel said softly, leaning forward. "We don't have to do this tonight. You're exhausted. We can figure this out tomorrow?" Emma's eyes stayed locked on the road ahead. "I'm not waiting," she muttered. Her voice was calm but firm like the quiet edge of a blade. "If Ethan thinks he can disappear and leave me with questions, he's wrong. I'm done being blindsided." Rachel sighed and sat back, crossing her arms. "Then at least let me call your mom. She's worried sick." "No," Emma said firmly. "Not until I know the truth." Beside her, Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He hadn't said much since they left the church, but his posture told her everything. He knew more than he was letting on. She glanced at him, her gaze sharp as glass. "You're quiet, Marcus?" He glanced at her, his face blank but his eyes tense. "Just focused on driving?" Her eyes narrowed. "Focused on driving or focused on what you're not telling me?" His jaw twitched. "Don't start, Emma." "Oh, I think we're past that," she shot back, leaning toward him. "You're going to tell me everything you know about Ethan. Every single thing." "I already told you," he said through clenched teeth. "I didn't know until this morning. He called me, told me to give you the letter, and that's it." Emma's eyes didn't leave him. "That's it? That's all he said?" "That's all he said," Marcus replied, his voice louder now, more defensive. He glanced at her with a glare. "I didn't ask questions, Emma, because I didn't think it would come to this." She shook her head slowly, disbelief settling on her face. "You didn't think? You didn't think?" Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "You stood there and watched me walk to that altar like a fool. You let me believe he was waiting for me. I didn't know what else to do." Marcus barked, slamming his palm against the steering wheel. The car jerked slightly as his control slipped for a second. "I didn't know how to stop it without making it worse." Rachel leaned forward, gripping the back of Emma's seat. "Hey, both of you, calm down before we end up in a ditch." Silence settled over the car again, thick and heavy like fog. The rain picked up, streaking down the windows in blurred lines. Emma turned away from Marcus, her jaw tight, her eyes glued to the raindrops sliding down the glass. "We'll see," she muttered. "When we get there, we'll see." The apartment building loomed ahead, dark and gray against the rainy night. Marcus pulled up to the curb, killing the engine. For a moment, none of them moved. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked quietly, his eyes on Emma. Her answer was already clear. She pushed the door open, stepping into the rain without hesitation. Her wedding dress trailed behind her, soaking up the water as she walked. "Of course she's sure," Rachel grumbled, following after her, pulling up the edges of her dress. "She's got that look in her eye. I've seen it before." Emma walked ahead, her steps quick and deliberate. The entrance doors clicked open as Marcus punched in the access code. They stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the air thick with the smell of old carpet and faint cleaning products. She knew Ethan's apartment like she knew her own. She'd spent countless evenings there, cooking dinner, curled up on the couch watching movies and dreaming of a future together. The thought of it made her stomach twist. They reached his door, apartment 3C. Emma stared at it for a moment, then reached out and gripped the handle. "Lock. Move," she said, stepping back. "Emma, don't," Rachel warned. But Emma's patience had run out. She stepped forward and kicked the door hard, her heels slamming into the wood just above the handle. It didn't give. Her heart pounded. She did it again and again, her frustration boiling over with every hit. "Emma, stop." Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "You're gonna hurt yourself." "I don't care," she shouted, yanking her arm free. She pounded her fists against the door, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. "He left me. He left me." Suddenly, Marcus reached into his pocket, pulled out a key and slid it into the lock. The door clicked open. Emma stared at him, her breathing hard and uneven. "You had a key this whole time?" Marcus didn't answer. He just pushed the door open and stepped inside. Emma followed, heart pounding like a drum in her ears. The place was a wreck. Drawers hung open in the kitchen. Cupboard doors were ajar. A jacket was draped over the back of a chair, but the suitcase that always sat by the coat rack was gone. Rachel covered her mouth. Looks like he left in a hurry. Emma scanned the apartment, her eyes sharp as she moved room to room. She checked the bedroom. His closet doors were open. Several hangers were empty. She checked the bathroom. Toiletries gone, his toothbrush missing. Her heart squeezed tighter with each discovery. She moved to the living room, her eyes scanning the shelves, the coffee table, the fireplace mantel. And then she stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. On the floor near the window was a photo. A photo she'd seen before. But this one was torn. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. Half of Ethan's face was visible, his familiar smile unmistakable. But next to him, on the part of the photo that was torn away, was the shoulder and hand of a woman. A woman wearing a distinct silver bracelet. Emma's heart slammed in her chest. She'd seen that bracelet before. Emma? Rachel called from behind her. Look at this, Emma said, holding the photo up. He was with someone? Rachel's eyes widened. Who is she? I don't know, Emma whispered, her mind racing. But I'm going to find out. Before she could say another word, a loud knock echoed from the front door. Everyone froze. Police, a deep voice called from outside. Detective Ramsey. Open up. Marcus's eyes went wide. What the? The door swung open and a man in a dark trench coat stepped inside, rain dripping from his coat and hat. His sharp gaze swept the room, landing on Emma, Rachel, and Marcus. Which one of you is Emma? The man asked, his voice rough but controlled. Emma stepped forward, the torn photo still in her hand. That's me. What's this about? Detective Ramsey pulled out a badge and flashed it quickly. His eyes narrowed as he pointed to Marcus. That one stays right where he is. Excuse me? Marcus said, taking a step back. Ethan Bennett is under investigation for financial fraud, Ramsey said, his tone sharp as a knife. And from where I'm standing, you're looking real friendly with his business partner. Emma's eyes shot to Marcus. Business partner? She echoed, her voice ice cold. No, Marcus stammered, holding up his hands. No, that's not right. I'm not. Don't move, Ramsey ordered, reaching for his radio. Emma's gaze darted between Marcus and Ramsey. Her mind felt like it had been ripped in half. Don't tell me you're in on this too, she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of betrayal. Marcus didn't answer. He just looked at her. And in that silence, Emma knew. She knew. The cold, sterile hum of the fluorescent lights above made everything feel sharper and colder than it needed to be. Emma sat stiffly at the small metal table in the police interrogation room, her eyes locked on the one-way mirror to her right. Her fingers tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm against the table's edge, her nails clicking in sync with the ticking clock mounted on the wall. Across from her sat Detective Warren Ramsey, his eyes trained on her like a hawk watching for its prey to slip up. He leaned forward, hands clasped together, the cuffs of his trench coat still damp from the rain. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp, but his movements were slow and methodical. You want to tell me why you were at Ethan Bennett's apartment tonight, Ms. Reed? Ramsey's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. Emma met his gaze, her eyes steady and unyielding. I'm his fiancée. Ex-fiancée, Ramsey corrected, leaning forward to emphasize the distinction. He left you at the altar, remember? Her fingers stopped tapping. Her eyes narrowed. You here to interrogate me or remind me how my day went? Ramsey tilted his head, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'm here to figure out if you knew your boyfriend was neck-deep in financial fraud. I didn't, Emma said, her voice flat but firm. Didn't know, huh? Ramsey pulled out a small notebook from his coat pocket and flipped it open. So you had no idea that Ethan Bennett was part of something called the Orion Project? Emma's face didn't flinch, but her heart did. She'd never heard those words before, but she knew better than to let it show. She kept her gaze locked on his. You can keep staring at me like that, Ramsey said, his pen tapping lightly against the paper. But I know you're wondering what the Orion Project is. I don't care what it is, Emma shot back, crossing her arms. I only care about where Ethan is. Ramsey's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. You think he's hiding from you? He asked, his eyes narrowing. He's not. He's hiding from me. Her heart skipped, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. If you know where he is, maybe you should stop wasting time with me and go find him. Funny, Ramsey said, leaning back in his chair. But here's the thing, Emma. People like Ethan? They don't disappear alone. They get help. People who think they're just doing a favor. People who think they're not doing anything wrong. Her eyes flicked toward the mirror, and for a split second she thought she saw movement behind the glass. Her gaze darted back to Ramsey. "Is that supposed to mean something to me?" she asked, tilting her head. "Not yet," Ramsey said with a shrug, standing up slowly. He tapped the notebook against his palm, staring at her like she was a puzzle he hadn't figured out yet. "But it will." He walked toward the door, pausing with one hand on the handle. "Word of advice, Ms. Reed. Stay out of this. You don't want to be on my list." The door clicked shut behind him and Emma let out a slow, controlled breath. She counted to 10 in her head, her eyes flickering back to the one-way mirror. She knew someone was watching. 30 minutes later, she sat on the curb outside the police station, the rain still falling in soft drizzles. Rachel sat next to her, their umbrellas forgotten on the ground. Neither of them spoke for a while. Emma's mind was moving too fast for words. Orion Project. She'd never heard of it before, but something about the way Ramsey said it stuck with her. It wasn't just a name. It was something more. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a text from her father. "Dad, please call me. I'm worried." Her thumb hovered over the screen, but she didn't reply. "Not yet." "You know he's right," Rachel said, hugging her knees close to her chest. "Who?" Emma muttered. "Detective Ramsey," Rachel replied, glancing at Emma. "He's right. This isn't your fight." Emma's eyes lifted from the phone, her gaze sharp as a knife. "Yes, it is." Rachel sighed, brushing rain-soaked hair from her face. "Em, you just got left at the altar. Take a second to breathe, for God's sake." "I can't," Emma snapped, her tone harsher than she meant. "I can't just sit around while everyone else knows something I don't." Rachel didn't argue. She didn't have to. Emma's mind was already made up. By 10 p.m. she was back at Ethan's apartment. This time there was no Marcus. No Rachel. Just Emma, her damp wedding dress swapped for jeans and a hoodie. She stepped inside and locked the door behind her, her breath fogging up the cold air. Her eyes scanned the room like it was her first time seeing it. She wasn't looking at furniture or decor. She was looking for patterns. Things out of place. Gaps where objects used to be. Signs of a man running. The drawers were still open, papers scattered like a storm had passed through. But this time, Emma noticed something different. A leather-bound notebook on the kitchen counter. Not Ethan's. She knew every notebook he owned, and this one wasn't his. Her fingers hovered over it for a moment before picking it up. She flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with numbers. Transactions. Amounts that didn't make sense. Offshore banks with names she didn't recognize. Her heart raced. This is it. She grabbed her phone and took pictures of every page, scanning them one by one. Her fingers moved with precision, her mind locking onto the strange bank account numbers and unfamiliar business names. Then she saw it. Orion Project. It wasn't just mentioned once, it was everywhere. Her fingers trembled as she snapped more photos. There was a name listed beside the transactions. Shaw and Partners? She whispered the name to herself, letting it sink in. Shaw. Suddenly, her eyes flicked to Ethan's laptop on the dining table. She moved toward it like a predator closing in on prey. She flipped the screen up, tapped the spacebar and waited. The login screen flickered to life. Password required. She typed in his birth date. No luck. She tried her own name. Nothing. Her breath hitched. Then she remembered something Ethan had once said. "I only use one password for everything. It's easy to remember but hard to guess." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, thinking. Something easy to remember but hard to guess. Her eyes darted to the framed photo of his old dog, Cooper, that still sat on the shelf. She typed, "Cooper Bennett 14. The screen unlocked. Her heart stopped. It worked. Her hands moved quickly, opening his email, his files, everything. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew she'd know it when she saw it. Her eyes landed on a file marked obdocs.zip. She clicked it and a password prompt appeared. "Damn it," she muttered. Her eyes scanned the room again, her mind spinning. Could be anything. A word. A date. A name. Then she remembered. Shaw and Partners. She typed Shaw 2023. The file opened. Her screen was suddenly filled with spreadsheets, legal documents, transfer receipts, and encrypted files marked confidential. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. This was bigger. Her phone buzzed on the table and she snatched it up. It was Rachel. "Emma?" Rachel's voice was panicked. "You need to get out of there. Marcus just called me. He said someone's watching you." The blood drained from Emma's face. Her eyes shot to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass she saw it. A black car. Parked across the street. Someone was inside, watching. Emma sat cross-legged on Rachel's living room floor, her eyes glued to the glowing laptop screen in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, scrolling through the endless rows of spreadsheets, transaction logs, and encrypted files she'd extracted from Ethan's laptop. She had no idea what half of it meant, but she knew one thing. This was a trail and she intended to follow it to the end. Rachel sat next to her, laptop on her knees, her brows furrowed in intense concentration. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a look of grim determination on her face. "You're quiet," Emma said, glancing at Rachel. "That's not like you." Rachel didn't look away from the screen. "I'm trying to decrypt a 256-bit encrypted file using open-source tools. It's not exactly pick a lock and twist easy." "English, please," Emma sighed. "It means," Rachel said, still typing, "that unless I'm a genius or very, very lucky, this might take hours, days, or never." She glanced up at Emma, her eyes sharp. "And judging by the files Ethan was hiding, I don't think we have days." Emma sat back, rubbing her hands over her face. Her head throbbed with a mix of exhaustion and frustration. "I can't believe this is happening. Yesterday I was planning a honeymoon. Now I'm here." She gestured at the mess of notes, screenshots, and hastily scrawled diagrams spread across Rachel's living room like a detective's crime board. "You're here," Rachel said, her tone firm but kind, "because you're stronger than you think." Emma huffed a weak laugh. "Feels like I'm just desperate." "Desperate people get things done," Rachel said, her eyes flicking back to the screen. "You're going to get answers, Emma. One way or another." The room went quiet again, except for the soft taps of keys and the distant hum of the rain against the window. Minutes later, Rachel gasped. "Oh, you sneaky little..." Emma snapped to attention. "What? Did you crack it?" Rachel grinned like she just unlocked a treasure chest. "Cracked it?" The key was hidden in plain sight. He named the encryption key after his old dog. "Classic." Emma's eyes widened. "Cooper?" "Yep," Rachel replied, tapping away. "But the kicker is he added the year 2014 to it. Rookie mistake." Rachel clicked on the decrypted file. Rows of text, emails, and attached files filled the screen. Her eyes moved rapidly as she scanned the data, her face growing more serious with each second. "Rachel, what is it?" Emma asked, sitting up straighter. "Hang on," Rachel said, leaning forward, her eyes locked on the screen. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she scrolled. "These emails, they're conversations between Ethan and some guy named Gregory Shaw." Emma's face went pale. "Shaw?" "Wait," Emma said, her heart skipping a beat. "Shaw? As in Shaw and Partners?" Rachel nodded, her eyes darting across the page. "Yeah, that's it. He's signing his emails as G. Shaw and using some fake company email, but it's him. There's no doubt." She pointed at one particular email. "Look at this. It's from 2 months ago." Emma leaned in, reading aloud. "Orion project milestones will be completed by Q3. Ensure no liabilities remain tied to Bennett's accounts." She blinked, the words repeating in her mind like a siren. "What does that mean?" "It means," Rachel said grimly, "that whatever the Orion project is, they were making sure it wouldn't be tied back to Ethan." Emma stared at the words, her jaw clenching so hard it ached. "They're cutting him loose? Or using him as a fall guy," Rachel muttered. "Either way, it's bad." Emma's gaze shifted back to the document, her eyes skimming line after line of cryptic references to OB funding, divestment strategy, and liability shifts. Every term felt more sinister than the last. And then she saw it. One name that froze her in place. Investor contact, Thomas Reed. Her heart stopped. Her father's name. Her father's name. Her breath hitched and she grabbed Rachel's wrist. "Scroll up." Rachel blinked, confused, but followed Emma's demand. She scrolled up slowly, her eyes scanning the text. There it was. Plain as day. Investor contact, Thomas Reed. "Is that?" Rachel's voice trailed off as she turned to Emma. Her eyes were wide with shock. Emma's hands shook. Her father. Her father. "No," she whispered, shaking her head like she could erase the name off the screen. No, that's a mistake." "Emma," Rachel said softly, but Emma was already on her feet, pacing back and forth like she was walking on hot coals. Her fingers tugged at her hair, her breathing shallow and rapid. "No," Emma said again, her voice louder this time. "He wouldn't be involved in this. He wouldn't." Her eyes darted to Rachel. "This could be fake, right? A setup." "It's a setup?" Rachel didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. The silence was answer enough. Emma's phone buzzed on the table. She snatched it up without looking at the screen. "Hello? Emma, it's Dad," came her father's familiar voice. It was calm, too calm. Her throat tightened. "Dad," she said slowly, her eyes flicking to Rachel. "I was just about to call you." "You okay?" he asked. His tone was soft, but there was something off about it, something too controlled. "I heard about Ethan. I wanted to make sure you're all right." Her heart pounded in her chest like a war drum. "Don't ask. Don't ask. Don't ask." But she couldn't stop herself. "Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "What do you know about the Orion project?" Silence. It was only 2 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. "Where did you hear that name?" her father asked, his voice tight now. All calmness was gone. Emma's legs gave out and she sat hard on the floor, eyes wide with disbelief. "He knows." She pressed the phone closer to her ear. "You invested, didn't you?" "Emma, listen to me." "Did you invest?" she snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Another pause. "I did," her father admitted softly. "But I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know what it really was." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. Her heart felt like it had been shattered for the second time in 24 hours. "How much, Dad?" she whispered, her voice hollow. "How much did you put in?" There was a long, painful sigh on the other end. "Our savings," he said. "All of it." Emma dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a sharp thud. Her entire body shook as she sat there, silent tears running down her face. She couldn't move. She couldn't even breathe. Rachel grabbed the phone, putting it to her ear. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice tense. "We'll call you back." She ended the call and knelt beside Emma, one hand on her shoulder. "Breathe, Emma," Rachel whispered, rubbing circles on her back. "Breathe. Don't lose it now." But Emma was done breathing. Her father. Her own father had put everything on the line for Ethan. And for what? What? Scams? Her vision blurred with tears, but her jaw clenched in cold determination. She wiped her face, sucking in a sharp breath like a diver preparing to plunge into the deep. Her voice was ice cold when she spoke. "I'm going to burn it all down," she said softly, her eyes locked on the files on Rachel's laptop. Rachel didn't ask what she meant. She already knew. "Then let's burn it," Rachel said, her eyes as hard as steel. Emma sat on the edge of her childhood bed, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling. Her mind buzzed with fragments of conversations, flashes of faces, and the cold, hard truth she'd just learned. Her fingers tightened around her phone as she stared at the last call she received. "Dad, 42 minutes ago." Her father had always been her rock. Steady. Unshakable. He'd raised her to believe in hard work and honesty. But now that image had cracks, cracks that no amount of love could patch up. "All of it," he'd said. "I put all our savings into it." She squeezed her eyes shut, a fresh wave of anger surging through her chest. Her breathing grew shallow, her fingers curling into fists. She felt Rachel sit down beside her, quiet but present. "You should talk to him," Rachel said gently, her eyes filled with concern. Emma shook her head, her jaw tight. "I have nothing to say to him." "Emma," Rachel's voice was soft but firm. "He's your dad. People make mistakes." Emma's eyes snapped to Rachel's. "This wasn't a mistake, Rach. This was reckless. This was stupid. He put everything on the line without telling me, without telling my mom. And for what?" She gestured toward the papers and screenshots sprawled across her bed. "For this?" Rachel didn't respond. She knew Emma wasn't ready for logic right now. Emma's phone buzzed again. Another call from her father. She didn't answer. Her fingers hovered over the block button, but something stopped her. She let it ring until it stopped. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a call. It was a text from Rachel. "You need to see this." Emma glanced at Rachel, who was sitting right next to her. Rachel gave her a nod. "Check your email," Rachel said, her eyes locked on her own phone. Her tone was urgent now. "I sent you a link to the shared drive. Look at the folder I just decrypted." Emma sat up, her heart already racing. She opened her email and clicked on the link. The shared drive opened with a folder labeled Orion_comms. Inside were dozens of email files, PDFs, and screenshots. Rachel tapped her phone a few more times, then pulled up a specific document and handed it to Emma. "Look at this one," Rachel said. "It's a series of emails between Ethan and Gregory Shaw. But there's something else." Emma scrolled down the document. Each email exchange was time-stamped and marked with Shaw's initials, Jeet Shaw. The language was coded but clear enough for Emma to pick up on the meaning. Shaw was talking about movement of assets and cleaning up exposure, classic corporate speak for covering tracks. Her eyes caught on one particular email. From G. Shaw at placeholderemail.com. To E. Bennett, ebinet@orionmail.com. Subject, Orion transfers, urgent. Need full removal of personal ties to the Bennett account by next Friday. I've attached the final list of participants. Send your confirmations ASAP. No liability should remain with Bennett or anyone linked to him. If he pushes back, remind him of the alternative. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She read it again, slower this time, taking in every word. Participants, she muttered, her eyes narrowing. Look at the attachment, Rachel said, her fingers tapping rapidly. She clicked open a PDF labeled Participants List.pdf. The document loaded slowly like it knew it held secrets. When it finally opened, Emma's eyes scanned the list of names, and her breath caught in her throat. Her father's name was there. Thomas Reed, private investor. Her face grew hot with rage. He's on the list, she muttered, her vision blurring with fury. He's on the list. Rachel sat forward, her face scrunched in confusion. Wait, that could mean anything. It doesn't mean he was in on it, Emma. He might have been a pawn just like Ethan. Don't, Emma snapped, her voice sharp like glass. Don't defend him. Rachel raised her hands, palms up, in a gesture of surrender. I'm just saying maybe he didn't know. These guys are pros at pulling in people with promises of high returns. Emma's eyes stayed on her father's name. Her mind flashed back to the time she'd overheard him on the phone. His voice hushed as he said, "It's a sure thing, Martha. We'll double it by Christmas." She'd thought it was just another one of his side hustles, a harmless investment. She'd been wrong. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down. Another call from her father. Her thumb hovered over the answer button, her lips pressed into a hard line. This time she answered. "Emma, please," her father's voice came through immediately. "Don't hang up." She didn't say anything. "I know you're mad," he continued, his voice tight with guilt. "But I didn't know, Emma. I swear to you, I didn't know it was like this. I just wanted to help. I thought it was going to help you, help our family. Help." Emma hissed, pacing the room now. "You call this helping?" Her voice shook with rage. "You put everything on the line for a scam. You risked everything we had." Her father sighed heavily. "I was trying to do the right thing, Emma. I thought I was doing the right thing." "No," she said, her tone ice cold. "The right thing would have been telling me the truth." Her father went quiet. She could hear his shallow breathing on the other end. After a long pause, he finally said, "You're right." Her breath caught in her chest. She didn't expect him to say that. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I was stupid. I was greedy, and I see that now. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Emma squeezed her eyes shut, her free hand covering her face as tears slipped through her fingers. "I'm so tired, Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm tired of all of it." "I know," he said, his voice cracking with his own grief. "I'm going to make it right, I swear." Emma didn't say goodbye. She hung up. Later that night, Emma sat at the dining table, staring at the pieces in front of her. Notes, screenshots, names. But it still wasn't enough. Not for someone like Gregory Shaw. "Rachel," Emma said, glancing at her friend. "We need help." "Help from who?" Rachel asked, setting her phone aside. Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a name she'd written on a torn scrap of paper. Elena Fisher, investigative journalist. Rachel's eyes widened. "Her?" Emma nodded. "She's exposed 3 corruption scandals and got 2 CEOs locked up. If anyone can get this out to the public, it's her." Rachel looked hesitant. "She's ruthless, Emma. She won't protect you." "I'm not looking for protection," Emma replied, her eyes hard as steel. "I'm looking for the truth." The next morning, Emma sat across from Elena Fisher in a small coffee shop. The journalist was sharp-eyed, mid-40s, and gave off the vibe of a predator that had just spotted fresh prey. Her notepad sat on the table, her pen poised to strike. "You're telling me you have proof that Gregory Shaw is laundering money, scamming investors, and planning to disappear?" Elena raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold claim." Emma slid the folder of printed emails and screenshots across the table. "I'm not here to make claims. I'm here to make it public." Elena flipped through the folder. Her eyes flicked up to Emma, her lips curving into a smile. "This is good." She glanced at Emma. "But if we do this, you'll be on every radar from here to Wall Street. You ready for that?" Emma's eyes burned with resolve. "I'm ready." Elena nodded, her eyes filled with something like admiration. "All right," she said, tucking the folder into her bag. "Let's burn it all down." The dim glow of streetlights flickered over the damp pavement as Emma sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's car, her eyes locked on the glowing screen of her phone. Her fingers scrolled through the encrypted files she'd received from Elena, cross-referencing them with old photos and screenshots. Rain slid down the car's windows, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and orange light. Elena's instructions had been clear. You want the real proof? It's not in the emails. It's on the USB. Ethan has it stored at a facility under one of his burner names. You get it and we have everything we need to bury Shaw. But knowing where it was didn't make it any easier to get. You sure this is the right address? Marcus asked, his eyes flicking between the road and the GPS. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, the muscles in his forearms flexing with tension. Positive, Emma replied, her gaze still focused on her phone. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. It's Unit B37 at the Blue Ridge storage facility. Ethan used one of his aliases to rent it. Which alias? Marcus asked, glancing at her. Jack Porter, Emma muttered, her voice laced with bitterness. Classic Ethan. Always thought he was so clever with his spy names. Marcus snorted, but there was no humor in it. He turned the corner, and the storage facility came into view. A cluster of gray windowless buildings lined up like soldiers, each one marked with a blocky letter and a number. No cameras, Marcus noted, glancing up at the perimeter of the facility. That's either really good luck or a really bad sign. Emma nodded, her stomach twisting with nerves. Probably both. He pulled up alongside one of the buildings, killed the engine and sat back in his seat, eyes scanning the lot. All right. We get in, we get the drive, and we get out. No hero moves, no second guessing. Agreed? Agreed, Emma said, already opening the car door. Rain poured down, soaking her hoodie within seconds, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on the entrance to Building B. They moved fast, heads down, feet splashing through shallow puddles. Each step echoed in the stillness of the night. The silence was unnerving, but Emma pushed the unease aside. They reached the door to the storage units. Emma pulled out the keycard that Elena had managed to source for them. Her fingers trembled as she swiped it through the reader. For a moment, nothing happened. Click. The door unlocked. Emma exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. We're in, she said quietly, glancing at Marcus. Lead the way, he muttered, eyes scanning the lot behind them. He was on edge and she knew why. Once inside, they were hit with the strong, musty scent of concrete and metal. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering like they hadn't been maintained in years. Rows of identical steel doors stretched out in front of them. B37, Emma said, her eyes darting from one side of the corridor to the other. She counted the unit numbers as they passed. B12, B18, B25. Her pulse quickened with each step. Her eyes flicked behind them, paranoia creeping in. Are we being followed? The sound of their footsteps echoed louder than it should have. B37, Marcus said, stopping in front of the unit. His eyes flicked left, then right, checking for anyone lurking. You got the key? Emma nodded, pulling out a small metal key that Elena had also provided. Her fingers shook as she inserted it into the lock. The mechanism clicked once, then again. Open. Just like that. She gripped the handle and pulled up. The metal door rolled open with a low, grating noise that made both of them flinch. Too loud. Fast, Emma, Marcus hissed, glancing back down the corridor. Her eyes scanned the contents of the unit. It was mostly junk, old duffel bags, a few boxes marked kitchen and office supplies, and an old coat rack leaning against the wall. No, Emma muttered, pulling open boxes and tossing aside their contents. Not here. Not here. Check the duffel, Marcus said, nodding toward the black duffel bag in the corner. Emma rushed to it, her hands unzipping it with swift precision. Inside were old clothes, a flashlight, and, her breath caught, a USB drive. Small. Black. Tucked into the side pocket like it didn't matter. Got it, she said, holding it up like it was a crown jewel. Marcus's eyes lit up with relief. Let's go. He was already at the door, peering down the hallway. Emma shoved the USB into her pocket, zipped up the duffel bag and followed. They moved quickly but not fast enough. Halfway down the corridor, a shadow moved at the far end. Stop. Emma froze. Marcus tensed beside her, his breath caught in his throat. A man stepped into view. He was wearing a black raincoat, the hood pulled low over his face. His hands were in his pockets, but the way he stood, firm and unyielding, sent a clear message. He wasn't here by accident. Keep walking, Marcus muttered, his voice low and controlled. Emma glanced at him, her pulse racing. He's watching us. Yeah, Marcus said, his eyes locked on the man. He's waiting to see if we'll run. They didn't run. They walked. Slowly, steadily, Every muscle in Emma's body coiled like a spring. She didn't dare look back, but she knew the man was following them. When they reached the front door, Marcus swiped the keycard again. Click. The door unlocked. "Go," Marcus said quietly, his voice as tense as a wire about to snap. They stepped into the rain, letting it wash over them as they moved quickly toward the car. Emma resisted the urge to glance behind her, even though her instincts screamed at her to check. "Is he following?" she asked under her breath. "Don't look," Marcus replied. "He's not stupid. If he's smart, he'll wait." They reached the car, climbed in, and locked the doors. Emma's heart was pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. Her fingers gripped the USB in her pocket like it was her last lifeline. "Drive," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Marcus started the engine. The car lurched forward, tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. She watched the rearview mirror. The man in the raincoat stood at the edge of the lot, hands still in his pockets. He didn't chase them. He didn't move. But he watched. "Who do you think he works for?" Marcus asked, his voice grim. "Shaw," Emma replied, her eyes still fixed on the rearview mirror. Her voice was cold now, steady. "It's always Shaw." They drove in silence for a while, the only sound the steady thump of rain on the roof. Emma pulled the USB from her pocket and turned it over in her hands. "This better be worth it," Marcus muttered. "Oh, it will be," Emma said quietly, her eyes hard as stone. "This is the end game." They stopped at Rachel's apartment, locking all the doors and windows before booting up Rachel's laptop. Emma plugged the USB in. Her heart raced as the files appeared on the screen. She scrolled past spreadsheets, contracts, and banking records. Then she found it. The payments list. Her eyes scanned the list of names, each one attached to a payment amount. Judges, police officials, politicians. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to Marcus. "These people, they're on payroll?" "Yeah," Marcus muttered, rubbing his face. "And Shaw's name is on every transaction." Her fingers hovered over the screen, her heart racing. This is everything." "It's enough to bury him," Rachel said, her voice shaking with disbelief. Emma leaned back in her chair, her eyes locked on the screen. But then her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We know what you have." Her heart stopped. Her gaze shot to the window. Across the street, a black sedan was parked by the curb. Her stomach twisted as cold realization set in. They're watching us. The gray sky hung low, thick with storm clouds that threatened to burst at any moment. Rain misted the air, slicking the concrete outside the old diner where Emma and Marcus had arranged to meet Detective Ramsey. Emma sat in a booth by the window, eyes locked on the door. Her foot tapped nervously against the tiled floor, her fingers gripping a cup of lukewarm coffee that had gone untouched. "Don't like this," Marcus muttered from across the table, his eyes scanning the street outside. His arms were folded tightly, his posture tense like a coiled spring. "Feels wrong?" Emma glanced at him, her jaw tight. "We have to do this. We can't keep running forever." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "We can't trust Ramsey. You saw how fast he showed up at Ethan's place. How did he know we were there?" She had asked herself that same question all night. It didn't add up. Ramsey had been too quick, too ready. But this was their only option, or at least that's what she kept telling herself. The bell over the diner door jingled, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. Detective Warren Ramsey stepped in, rain dripping from his trench coat. His sharp eyes swept the room until he spotted them. He didn't smile. He never did. Marcus shifted, his fingers drumming against the table. Emma shot him a warning look. "Stay calm." Ramsey approached slowly, like a lion stalking its prey. He pulled out the chair across from Emma and sat down with a heavy sigh, his eyes moving from her to Marcus. "Morning," he said flatly, shaking rain from his coat. He leaned back, hands clasped in front of him, his eyes locked on Emma. "You got something for me?" Emma nodded slowly, her eyes unreadable. "I have the USB." Ramsey tilted his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You brought it with you?" "Not exactly," Emma replied, leaning forward slightly. "It's in a safe place. I didn't think it was smart to carry it around." Ramsey's smirk disappeared. His eyes narrowed. "That wasn't the deal, Emma?" Her heart thudded in her chest, but she kept her face calm. "Plans changed, Detective. We're not stupid." Silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Ramsey's jaw shifted as he leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. He drummed his fingers on the table slowly, his gaze sharp and calculating. "You think I'm playing you?" Ramsey's voice was low and dangerous now, his eyes hard as steel. You think I'm the bad guy here? Marcus leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Ramsey. If the shoe fits. Ramsey glanced at Marcus, his eyes cold and unreadable. Listen to me, kid. I'm the only one standing between you and a warrant with your name on it. Marcus snorted, shaking his head. Funny, I thought that was supposed to be Ethan's job. Emma's eyes stayed on Ramsey, watching every micro-movement of his face. The slight twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped an uneven rhythm on the table, and most of all, the fact that he hadn't once asked where the USB was. He already knew. Her heart sank, cold realization washing over her. He wasn't here to help. He was here to collect. We should go, Emma said, her voice firm. Ramsey's eyes flicked to her and his fingers stopped tapping. Sit down, Emma. Her pulse spiked. She felt Marcus shift in his seat. Stay calm. Stay in control. I said, Ramsey repeated, his eyes locking onto hers. Sit down. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Make me? Her chair scraped back loudly as she stood, grabbing her coat and walking toward the door. Marcus followed her lead instantly, his eyes flicking to the other side of the diner where two men in plain clothes had been sitting quietly since they'd arrived. Emma had noticed them, but now she realized exactly what they were. Backups. Ramsey's voice followed them. You walk out that door, Emma, and I promise you'll regret it. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. Emma, Ramsey called, his voice sharper now. You don't know what you're dealing with? She shoved the door open, letting the cold air slap her in the face. Neither do you. Back in the car, Marcus was fuming. His hands gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. I told you, he snapped, glancing at Emma. I told you we couldn't trust him. Emma leaned forward, hands buried in her hair. Her heart was still racing. She'd felt it, that creeping sensation that comes when you know someone's already 2 steps ahead of you. I know, she muttered. I know, Marcus. He glanced at her, his face hard with frustration. What now, huh? They know we have the USB. They'll come after us. Then we stop running, Emma said, sitting up straight, her eyes sharp as glass. We stop hiding? Marcus raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? She met his eyes, her gaze hard and unyielding. We go to Shaw. Marcus blinked, stunned into silence. He let out a laugh, but it was humorless. You've lost it? No, Emma said, shaking her head. He's expecting us to run. Everyone is. But what if we go straight to him? No hiding. No games. We hit him where he feels safest. You're talking about walking into a lion's den, Marcus muttered, rubbing his face. You know that, right? Yeah, Emma said, her eyes blazing. But this time I'm not the prey. Later that night, they sat outside a dimly lit warehouse on the edge of the city. Rain poured down, soaking their clothes and fogging up the car windows. The glow of distant streetlights barely reached them. Tell me we have a plan, Marcus muttered, his eyes locked on the warehouse entrance. 2 guards stood outside, both wearing earpieces, their faces blank as stone. We have a plan, Emma said, pulling her hood up. We walk in. Terrible plan, Marcus muttered. Do you have a better one? She shot back, her eyes flicking toward him. Yeah, he said with a dry laugh. Not doing this. Too late, she muttered, pushing the car door open. They crossed the lot together, walking straight up to the 2 guards. The men tensed immediately, their hands twitching toward their waistbands. Relax, Emma said, raising her hands. I'm here for Gregory Shaw. The guards shared a look, their eyes narrowing. Name? One of them asked. Emma Reed, she said, her voice calm but firm. Tell him I have something he's been looking for. The guards didn't move. One of them muttered something into his earpiece, his eyes never leaving hers. Minutes passed like hours. Emma didn't flinch. Then the door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, broad shoulders, salt and pepper hair slicked back. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly pressed. Gregory Shaw. Well, Shaw said, his voice smooth like honey laced with poison. His eyes raked over her like a predator sizing up its prey. Emma Reed. You've certainly made a lot of noise for someone so small. Emma stepped forward, not an ounce of fear in her step. Her eyes were like ice. I'm here to make a deal. Shaw raised an eyebrow, his grin sharp as a knife. You? Make a deal with me? He let out a slow, condescending laugh. You have guts, I'll give you that. Her eyes didn't waver. You're going to want to hear what I have to say. Shaw's grin vanished. His eyes flicked toward Marcus, then back to her. All right, Ms. Reed, he said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the open door behind him. Let's see if you're as brave as you think you are. She didn't hesitate. She walked inside. Marcus followed, his eyes darting left and right like a soldier preparing for a fight. The door slammed shut behind them. Rain cascaded down in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof of Marcus's car like a chaotic symphony. The warehouse loomed ahead, shrouded in darkness, its silhouette broken only by the faint glow of floodlights positioned near the entrance. Emma sat in the back seat, eyes fixed on the entrance like a hawk watching its prey. Her hoodie was pulled up, shadows dancing across her face, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. In the front seat, Elena Fisher adjusted the focus on her camera. Her face was illuminated by the dim glow of the screen as she set the angle. Her eyes flickered with sharp focus and experience, like a predator lying in wait. "Get closer," Elena muttered to Marcus, who sat in the driver's seat, engine off, but his fingers drumming against the wheel. "If I get closer, their guys will see us," Marcus replied, his tone clipped. His eyes stayed locked on the two guards posted outside the warehouse. They had the same stone-faced expressions as before, hands near their waists where their weapons likely sat holstered. Emma leaned forward, peering between the front seats. "Elena's right. We need a better shot. If we don't have clear footage of Shaw taking that cash, we lose everything." Marcus sighed, his jaw tightening, but he threw the car into neutral and rolled it forward slowly, tires barely making a sound on the wet asphalt. As soon as they reached a better angle, Elena tapped his shoulder. "Stop. Right here." She adjusted her camera, zooming in on the large, garage-style door where Shaw's crew had just opened it to let in a sleek, black SUV. "Here we go," Elena said, her breath fogging the window as she spoke. "They're making the drop." Inside the warehouse, two men in suits stepped out of the SUV. One of them carried a metal briefcase. Gregory Shaw emerged from the shadows, his hands in his pockets, his grin as sharp as a blade. He greeted the men with a handshake that lingered too long, the kind of handshake where deals were made. "Bingo," Elena muttered as she filmed every second. "We've got him." "Not yet," Emma said, her eyes narrowing. "We need to see the cash." As if on cue, one of the suited men placed the briefcase on a metal table inside the warehouse. He opened it slowly, revealing stacks of cash bound with neat red bands. "There it is," Marcus breathed. "We got him." Elena's finger hovered over the recording button. "Not yet. We keep rolling. The longer we film, the more incriminating it gets. We need voices. We need context." Emma nodded, her heart racing. "Get every word." Shaw leaned in, speaking low, but Elena's high-end microphone caught it all. "All bribes are accounted for," Shaw said, his voice smooth and businesslike. "Judge Martinez gets his 10%, the police chief gets 5%, and as for our friends at customs..." He tilted his head toward one of the suited men. "They're going to need a little extra encouragement after last week's inspection." One of the suited men chuckled. "Consider it done." Elena's mouth curled into a grin. "Gotcha, you slimy son of a..." "Shoo," Emma hissed, placing a hand on Elena's arm. Her eyes locked on the warehouse entrance. One of the guards had stepped out of formation, eyes scanning the lot. "He sees us," Marcus muttered, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. "No," Emma said quickly. "He's just checking the lot." But her heart was pounding now. Her gaze flicked to Elena. "We have enough?" "More than enough," Elena replied, shutting off the camera and sliding it into her backpack. "That's conspiracy, bribery, and money laundering all in one scene. The judge, the cops, customs, he tied them all together on tape." Emma reached for the burner phone in her pocket, her fingers moving fast as she dialed a number. She'd only called this number once before. Detective Ramsey answered on the second ring. "This better be good," he said, his voice rough with suspicion. "You want Gregory Shaw?" Emma said, her voice low but steady. "He's at the old Garrett Street warehouse right now. He's doing a drop. Cash in hand. You bring Interpol and you can have them all." There was silence on the line. "Why are you calling me?" Ramsey asked, his tone sharp. "Last I checked, you didn't trust me." "I still don't," Emma said, glancing at Marcus and Elena. "But I trust Interpol. You bring them or I call them myself." Another pause. Then, "Stay put. Don't move." The line went dead. Emma leaned back in the seat, letting out a slow, shaky breath. "He's coming?" "Yeah," Marcus muttered, shifting in his seat, eyes flicking to the guards. "But so are they." The two guards were walking straight toward them now, their hands at their waists. "Move," Marcus hissed, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. "No," Emma barked, gripping his arm. "Don't run. If we run, they'll chase. Stay calm." "Calm?" Marcus hissed, eyes wide. "They're armed, Emma." "I know," she said, her voice eerily calm. "That's why we don't give them a reason. The guard stopped just short of the car. One of them tapped on the window with 2 fingers, his face blank but his eyes cold. "Step out of the car," he said. Emma glanced at Marcus, her heart pounding. She glanced at Elena, who shook her head slowly. "Don't do it." But it was too late. Marcus threw the car in reverse, tires screeching against the wet pavement. "Go, go, go," Emma yelled. The guards reached for their guns. A loud bang echoed through the night. "Get down," Marcus shouted, ducking as he slammed the car into drive. The sound of shattering glass filled the air as a bullet struck the rear windshield. Emma ducked, covering her head with her hands. She felt the shards of glass rain down on her. Her heart was a drumline in her chest. Marcus swerved hard, tires screeching as he veered onto the main road. "Are you hit?" he shouted, glancing at Emma in the mirror. "I'm good," Emma shouted, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "You?" "I'm fine," Marcus said, but his voice sounded strained. His left arm hung awkwardly at his side. Emma's eyes widened. "Marcus, you're bleeding?" He glanced at his arm, his shirt soaked with crimson. "It's fine. It's a graze. Pull over," Emma snapped. "No," he barked back. "Not until we lose them." Emma glanced behind them. Headlights were coming fast. 2 cars. Black sedans. She knew instantly they were Shaw's men. Her breath came fast and shallow. "No, no, not like this." "Cut through the industrial park," Elena shouted, pointing. "Left now." Marcus cranked the wheel hard, tires slipping on the wet road. The car fishtailed but corrected itself as they shot down the narrow alley between warehouses. "They're gaining," Emma yelled, glancing out the back. "I see them." Marcus gritted his teeth, one hand gripping the wheel, the other pressing against his bleeding arm. Suddenly, flashing blue and red lights lit up the sky. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every second. "Interpol," Emma muttered, her breath hitching with relief. The black sedan skidded to a halt. The sound of shouting, metal doors slamming, and footsteps echoed through the rain. Emma's heart pounded as she turned, watching it all unfold. Agents swarmed. Guns drawn. Men in suits thrown to the ground. Gregory Shaw's face twisted in rage as Interpol agents shoved him against the side of a car, cuffing his hands behind his back. Emma gripped the USB in her hand so tightly it hurt. "This is it." Her eyes locked on Shaw's as he was dragged past. For a moment they stared at each other. His eyes burned with cold fury, but hers? Hers were unshakable. She leaned forward, her eyes like daggers. "Checkmate, Shaw." The courtroom buzzed with energy, the kind of tense, electric energy that only exists when something monumental is about to happen. Cameras clicked furiously from behind the press barricade, the sharp flashes lighting up the courtroom in short bursts. Murmurs rippled through the rows of spectators, a sea of faces filled with curiosity, doubt, and judgment. Emma sat at the witness stand, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her heart pounded, but her face remained calm. The fluorescent lights overhead were harsh, illuminating every line, every shadow on her face. She knew every major network was watching. She knew the entire country was watching. Across from her, Gregory Shaw sat at the defense table. His sharp suit was as crisp as ever, his salt and pepper hair combed back perfectly. But his face wasn't as smug as it had been weeks ago. His eyes watched her carefully, no longer with arrogance, but with calculation. He had underestimated her once. He wouldn't do it again. Her eyes met his, unwavering. "Not this time." "Ms. Reed," the prosecutor's voice rang through the room, pulling Emma's attention. "Let's begin." Emma leaned forward slightly, placing her hands on the edge of the stand. Her fingers curled into the smooth wood as she drew in a steady breath. Her gaze shifted to the jury, 12 people who held Shaw's fate in their hands. "Ms. Reed," the prosecutor said, adjusting his tie, "for the record, can you state your name and occupation?" "Emma Reed," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Former operations manager for Willow Heights Consulting." "Thank you, Ms. Reed," the prosecutor said, pacing slowly as he glanced down at his notes. "Now, can you tell the court how you first became involved in the investigation into Gregory Shaw?" Emma glanced briefly at Shaw, then back at the jury. "It started on my wedding day," she said bluntly, earning a ripple of murmurs from the crowd. "My fiancé, Ethan Bennett, left me at the altar. Hours later, I found out that he was under investigation for financial fraud." Her words hit the room like a sudden gust of wind. Even those who knew the story leaned forward, their attention hooked. "And what did you do after learning this information?" the prosecutor asked, stepping closer, his tone encouraging but firm. Emma took another steady breath. "I went looking for answers." Her gaze flicked back to Shaw. I went to Ethan's apartment, and that's where I found the first signs that something bigger was going on. Torn photographs, offshore bank statements, encrypted files. She leaned forward, her eyes focused on the jury. And all of it led to one name, Gregory Shaw. Shaw's attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. The judge, a stout man with a deep, commanding voice, glanced over his glasses. Sustained. Ms. Reed, keep your statements limited to the facts. Emma nodded. Understood, Your Honor. The prosecutor stepped forward, hands in his pockets. Ms. Reed, you later retrieved a USB drive from a secure storage unit. Is that correct? Yes, she replied. It contained financial records, bribe ledgers, and encrypted communications between Gregory Shaw, my ex-fiancé Ethan Bennett, and several high-ranking officials. The prosecutor raised a hand. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit 12 into evidence. The contents of the USB drive recovered by Ms. Reed. The judge nodded. So ordered. The court clerk wheeled a cart to the front of the room, placing a screen where the jury could see it. Moments later, the contents of the USB flashed on the screen. Page after page of spreadsheets, emails, payment records, and internal memos filled the display. The room went silent as the prosecutor approached Emma. Ms. Reed, do you recognize these files? He asked, his voice steady but firm. Yes, Emma replied, her voice unwavering. These are the files I found on Ethan Bennett's USB drive. They outline the Orion Project, a network of fraudulent shell companies used to launder bribe money to judges, police officials, and customs agents. Her words sent a wave of shock through the gallery. The press section lit up with flashing cameras. Shaw's attorney quickly rose to object, but the judge's gavel struck down before he could say a word. Order, the judge called, his voice booming. Ms. Reed, the prosecutor continued, can you identify the specific file? He pointed to an email on the screen. Emma tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. She knew it well. That's the email where Gregory Shaw instructs Ethan to clean up liabilities tied to the Bennett account. Can you read the email for the court? Emma nodded, her voice strong. Need full removal of personal ties to the Bennett account by next Friday. No liability should remain with Bennett or anyone linked to him. If he pushes back, remind him of the alternative. The weight of those words filled the air, heavier than the rainstorm outside. No one moved. No one spoke. The prosecutor glanced back at the jury, letting the words sink in. He turned to Emma, his expression serious but triumphant. And Ms. Reed, in your understanding, what was the alternative Mr. Shaw was referring to? Emma didn't hesitate. It meant ruining Ethan. It meant using him as a scapegoat for the entire scheme. Did Ethan know? Emma's face hardened. He knew. But by the time he figured it out, it was too late. Shaw had already cut him loose. The prosecutor nodded, pacing slowly. One last question, Ms. Reed. Why did you decide to come forward? You could have stayed silent. You could have walked away. The room was so still you could hear the rain hitting the windows. Emma's eyes shifted to the jury. She sat up straighter, her gaze sharp and filled with resolve. Her heart no longer pounded with fear, only purpose. I came forward, she said, her voice clear as glass, because I spent too long thinking I could trust people who didn't deserve it. I let myself believe that everything would work out if I just stayed quiet. Her gaze swept over the jury, her voice rising with each word. But silence doesn't stop corruption. Silence lets it grow. So, I decided that if no one else was going to stand up, I would. Her words echoed in the quiet courtroom. Her eyes locked with Shaw's one final time. People like Gregory Shaw think they can do whatever they want and no one will fight back. But I'm here to tell you they're wrong. The silence that followed was longer than any before it. No one dared to breathe. The judge finally nodded. Thank you, Ms. Reed. You may step down. Emma stood, her back straight, her head held high. As she walked past Shaw, he didn't meet her eyes. He kept his gaze locked on the table in front of him, his fingers tapping a slow, erratic rhythm. The verdict came 2 hours later. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as he read it aloud. On the charges of conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering, the jury finds the defendant, Gregory Shaw, guilty on all counts. Emma closed her eyes, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled slightly, but she gripped them tightly together. She glanced to the side where Elena and Marcus sat in the gallery, grins on their faces. Marcus still had his arm in a sling, but his grin was brighter than she'd ever seen it. Defendant is hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, the judge declared, his gavel striking down with finality. Emma sat still, letting the moment wash over her. It's done. It's over. The press swarmed as soon as she left the courtroom. Flashes of light exploded in her face, and microphones were shoved toward her. Ms. Reed, do you have a statement? She turned toward the cameras, eyes sharp and steady. Yeah, I do. She stepped closer, her voice calm but powerful. Tell them all, the people who hide behind suits and contracts, the ones who think no one will ever stand up to them, tell them we're coming. Her words hit like a thunderclap. Reporters leaned forward, pens flying. And this time, she said, her eyes burning with fire, we won't stop. Emma faced betrayal, heartbreak, and danger, but she never stopped fighting for the truth. If you were in her shoes, would you have kept going or would you have walked away? Do you think justice was truly served in the end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If Emma's journey inspired you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more moving narratives like this one.